On the broadcast tonight, the death of Osama Bin Laden, the raid, how U.S. Special Forces got him, the reaction here at home and around the world, and the reality. What does it mean for the Americans fighting overseas and for those who lost loved ones on 9/11, including the New York City firehouse we visited today, where that day will never be forgotten. Nightly news from Ground Zero tonight begins now.
The death of Osama Bin Laden. This is a special edition of NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
Good evening from Ground Zero in Lower Manhattan. Osama Bin Laden is dead. The man who killed thousands of innocent people, the man who launched the United States into 2 wars in the name of that attack, the man who changed the way we have to live in this country, the man who did all of this was killed by U.S. Special Forces acting on orders from President Obama. We first learned his name back when there was still smoke rising from Ground Zero behind us here. The U.S. came close to getting him, but could not. He was villainized. He became something of a cartoonish, cave-dwelling creature over time. In the end, though, we learned he was living well under deep cover, but it wasn't deep enough. As the president and his national security team watched on live TV in real time at the White House, 2 choppers full of Americans landed in his compound in Pakistan, rappelled down ropes, and came in shooting. He died along with several others in the attack. He's already been buried at sea. A chapter is now over while a new one begins. We have comprehensive coverage for you here tonight, beginning with the military operation. NBC's Jim Miklaszewski remains on duty at the Pentagon to start us off. Jim, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. The CIA made it official today that DNA testing positively confirms the Navy SEALs got their man. The massive compound that was Osama bin Laden's base of operations sat empty today after U.S. Special Operations pulled off their daring nighttime raid. It was President Obama himself who broke the news.
Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda.
It was midnight in Pakistan. American helicopters loaded with Navy SEALs hugged the ground to avoid detection by Pakistani radar as they closed in for the kill. As the choppers approached the heavily fortified al-Qaeda compound, small arms fire erupted from the rooftops, and then panic. One of the helicopters suddenly lost altitude and was forced to land in the middle of the compound. No Americans were injured, and within minutes, as many as 24 commandos swarmed the complex in search of bin Laden. In a firefight that raged on for nearly 40 minutes, the SEALs first killed 2 al-Qaeda operatives in a small building at the edge of the compound. The Americans then moved to the main residence, systematically searching room by room up to the 3rd floor, where they found Osama bin Laden and his 19-year-old son. U.S. officials say as the SEALs closed in, bin Laden opened fire with an automatic weapon. The SEALs shot back, killing bin Laden's son and a woman caught in the crossfire. Bin Laden was the last to die, with at least 1 gunshot to the head. And this video, obtained by ABC News, reportedly shows the inside of the room where bin Laden was killed. U.S. military officials say the mission was to kill, not to capture bin Laden, and believe there was no other way out.
The word was that Osama bin Laden would not surrender, and that indeed his security agents had been told to kill him if it looked like they were about to lose him to a U.S. snatch operation.
The American commandos departed with bin Laden's body, and before the end of the day, his remains were aboard the U.S. aircraft carrier Carl Vinson, where U.S. officials say he was given a proper Muslim burial at sea. Pentagon officials said thousands were involved in the bin Laden operation. The CIA and other intelligence services tracked him down while the U.S. military took him out.
This is what we call a clean hit, and I think an extremely solid piece of work, both from an intelligence and special operations standpoint.
And that intelligence windfall may just be beginning. U.S. officials say that Navy SEALs recovered large volumes of computer data and hard drives, so much of it that could potentially provide valuable intelligence on al-Qaeda. And in fact, there is so much of it that they've created an entire task force all its own just to wade through it all, Brian.
Jim Miklaszewski, after a long night on this story and a long day at the Pentagon. Jim, thanks. Last night, when it happened, a bit in advance, a few of us, a handful of journalists, received phone calls from the White House telling us to get to our offices and studios, that a big announcement was coming. And what a long night it was at the White House. Our White House correspondent, Savannah Guthrie, is with us here in New York tonight. She has exclusive details, really behind the scenes, as to what was unfolding that we couldn't see.
Yeah, we've learned actually that this special ops team actually practiced this raid in early April twice at a mock compound here on U.S. soil. They were prepared to take bin Laden alive, but expected him to fight and die. He was shot twice in the left eye by a commando who encountered him on the third floor of the compound and instantly recognized him as Osama Bin Laden.
I think we can all agree this is a good day for America.
The president at a Medal of Honor ceremony today, one day after ordering U.S. forces to take out America's most wanted terrorists.
The world is safer. It is a better place because of the death of Osama bin Laden.
Today, aides are describing the incredibly tense moments inside the Situation Room. As NBC first reported, the president was able to monitor the 40-minute operation as it unfolded, getting what a top U.S. official described as audio and visual updates from the ground.
It was probably one of the most anxiety-filled periods of time, I think, in the lives of the people who were assembled here yesterday.
Getting word of bin Laden's capture, a senior aide says applause broke out in the Situation Room. The president remarked, "We got him." Then, minutes before midnight, nearly 10 years after that awful September day, the president addressed the nation.
The American people did not choose this fight. It came to our shores. We can say to those families who have lost loved ones to al-Qaeda's terror, justice has been done.
USA! USA! Outside the White House gates, a spontaneous outpouring as crowds gathered to rejoice. On Capitol Hill today, the celebration was bipartisan.
The last thing Osama bin Laden saw on this earth was a small team of Americans who shot him.
Officials found bin Laden by tracking his longtime trusted courier. In August, finding him in a compound outside of Islamabad, a walled fortress valued at over $1 million, yet with no phone or internet service. Officials believe it was custom built to hide Osama bin Laden. A U.S. official says the president considered 4 different options, ultimately rejecting a plan to have stealth bombers wipe out the compound, instead going for a riskier helicopter assault with special ops forces.
The president had to evaluate the strength of that information and then made what I believe was one of the most gutsiest calls of any president in recent memory.
On Friday morning, the president gave the official order, then went on with business, touring storm-ravaged Alabama, giving a commencement speech in Florida, even attending the annual White House Correspondents' Dinner, where he gave no hint of what was about to unfold.
People think bin Laden is hiding in the Hindu Kush, but did you know that every day from 4 to 5 he hosts a show on C-SPAN?
One other note, this operation had a code name for success, which would have been a capture or kill of bin Laden. The code name was Geronimo. I can report tonight the actual transmission from the ground commander at the compound to the operational commander in Afghanistan. He said, "For God and country, Geronimo, Geronimo, Geronimo."
Incredible detail. It was a patriotic outpouring, and I guess it started there in the Situation Room. Savannah Guthrie with her reporting from inside the White House tonight. And if you were watching our coverage last night, as Savannah alluded to, this spontaneous gathering in Lafayette Park across from the White House, there was another one here at Ground Zero in New York, but that was just the start of the American reaction from coast to coast. Lester Holt with us, part of our coverage, with more on that aspect. Lester?
Brian, think back to last night. How many unknowns were there? First of all, the president says he's going to go on national TV. No one knew what he was going to say. Even later, when we realized it was going to be word about the death of Osama bin Laden, no one knew how the American public would receive that information. And yet, surprisingly, across the country, the reaction was very much the same. It was the refrain echoed from every corner of America. As the news began to spread, crowds descended on the White House and Times Square in New York.
The job is completed. Maybe we can bring our troops home.
From college campuses to the stands at a Philadelphia Phillies game, to the streets of Boston. There were unabashed celebrations over the death of a villain.
He was the mastermind of so many terrorist attacks and so many terrible things that happened to U.S. people, so I'm happy he's dead.
His death reminded us of the many faces and names of Bin Laden's victims.
They finally got him, and of course it makes me cry again because it brings back memories.
Emotions were especially raw today at what are now hallowed grounds, Shanksville, Pennsylvania.
Gives you a special feeling here just to pay homage to the people we lost that day.
The Pentagon.
Just a good day to be a United States Marine and an American citizen.
And Ground Zero.
Look at the Freedom Tower.
Jack Zilmanowitz and his wife Evelyn came to honor Jack's brother Abe, who was killed in the World Trade Center.
Finally, the purveyor of evil was brought to justice.
Off-duty Boston-based flight attendants who lost colleagues on American Flight 11 tried to find closure here, too.
When we heard of the tragedy, it was just a question of who we knew, because that was a flight that was always staffed by Boston flight crews.
And you happen to be on a layover here in New York today.
Just arrived.
And was there any question that you had to come down here?
No, as soon as we heard the news, we all four said we're going to Ground Zero.
Even as a gleaming new tower rises, filling in the once scarred hole of Ground Zero, the outpouring and celebrations over the death of Osama bin Laden remind us the wound to the American psyche is not so easily healed. At a lot of these gatherings, you hear a fair amount of bravado, even around us here on the streets, but also whispered under the breath that fear, Brian, that what may be a major blow against terror could simply open up a new chapter.
Lester, thanks for that. It's an important part of the reporting of this entire story. So is this. Quoting off the Associated Press, the FBI and Department of Homeland Security are warning people that the death of bin Laden will, quote, likely inspire homegrown extremists in the U.S. to try to carry out attacks in the near term. The very best possible person to talk about this issue where we are right now is the longtime commissioner of the Police Department, City of New York, Ray Kelly. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Brian.
I was driving through Midtown Manhattan last night. I saw these columns, now familiar to New Yorkers, squad cars moving through the city, very visible. Let's say a family of four is coming to visit us here in New York tonight. What will they see?
They'll see an increased uniform presence, certainly in Times Square. Tomorrow, they'll have it in the financial district in Lower Manhattan, certainly on the subway system. We have dogs. We have what we call surges, where uniformed officers would go in large numbers. So they will see increased police presence in the near term.
You and I have talked about this in plain English. Because New York didn't get the federal funding you wanted, you needed, you thought you deserved, you have set up a kind of mini CIA, mini FBI here. You've got eyes on major parts of this city. Do you feel your infrastructure is up to perhaps an increased tempo of what we've seen for 10 years?
I think that, it's certainly a possibility. We are doing everything we possibly can to protect the city. The infrastructure is protected as best we can. We have some old structures here, like just about every city has. But the mayor has made certain that we have the money to protect the city. He said that to me, do whatever you have to do to make it safe, and we'll find the money. So infrastructure is actually a long-term federal issue. Bridges, highways, that sort of thing.
And you have no reason to suspect an uptick in anything right now?
We have no information, no immediate threats against New York City, but obviously this is good news with complications. We have to be prepared for some sort of retaliatory act, and we are. We're working with our federal partners to see that we're ready.
Commissioner, thank you. You've always been very kind to us. Commissioner Ray Kelly of the NYPD. We'll take a break in our coverage here from Ground Zero in New York. When we come back, again, in plain English, we thought he was living in a cave. We were comforted by that knowledge, in fact. So how long was he living in a nice home, and how many people knew about it? And later, a New York City firehouse that lost 6 guys on 9/11. We'll have my visit there today and their reaction to this news.
Who's making tomorrow's history today? The extraordinary men and women of the Griots 100, living their dreams and changing our world. Their stories this month on the platforms of NBC News and thegriot.com.
Back here at Ground Zero, Lower Manhattan, as you look at a live picture of what's going to be the memorial, the old footprint of the buildings. We just received news from the White House. President Obama will visit Ground Zero on Thursday of this week. You'll recall it was his predecessor, George W. Bush, who made history by grabbing that megaphone on that awful day and addressing the workers. The president, again, will visit here on Thursday. Returning to what I said before the break, a lot of Americans thought Osama bin Laden was frankly living in a cave, on the run all these years. We were surprised, a lot of people were, to find out he was living in a very nice home, the best in that area. Question is how many other people knew about it. Our chief foreign affairs correspondent, Andrea Mitchell, in our Washington bureau, has been working this aspect of the story all day. Andrea, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. In the end, Osama bin Laden wasn't underground in a remote mountain cave after all. He was living in luxury in a suburb of Pakistan's capital, on land controlled by the military, hiding in plain sight. In this sleepy military town only 35 miles from Islamabad, bin Laden's million-dollar compound was a McMansion, with 12 to 18-foot walls topped by barbed wire dwarfing the neighbors, many of them retired military. There were other red flags. The luxury home, 8 times the size of nearby houses, had no internet access or phone service. The bin Ladens even burned their trash. In these CIA satellite pictures, neighbors are almost next door. And less than a mile away, Pakistan's military academy, the equivalent of our West Point.
Well, it is a little incredible, and my personal view is that they certainly probably were aware of it.
U.S. intelligence concluded it could only have been built for bin Laden. So how could Pakistan's army and spies not notice?
Could be a case of eyes wide shut, which they were aware of it and decided to keep their eyes open but closed as far as Americans are concerned.
Today, even some of the neighbors are wondering, reports Al Jazeera's Imtiaz Tayyab.
There are a lot of questions being asked about the role of the Pakistani intelligence agency and as well the Pakistani military.
The neighborhood certainly noticed the raid, blogged in real time on Twitter by @ReallyVirtual. Helicopter hovering above Abbottabad at 1 a.m. is a rare event. Now I'm the guy who live blogged the Osama raid without knowing it. Since 9/11, the U.S. has poured almost $20 billion into Pakistan without getting a reliable ally. In 1998, after bin Laden bombed 2 U.S. embassies in Africa, Bill Clinton couldn't get Pakistan to cooperate in going after the terrorist. After 9/11, Colin Powell told Pakistan's leaders they had to target al-Qaeda, but little happened. Last year, Hillary Clinton said what many were thinking.
But I believe that somewhere in this government are people who know where Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda is.
Today, the president's anti-terror chief said that it is inconceivable that bin Laden didn't have a support system inside Pakistan. And he acknowledged people are wondering if that support came from Pakistan's government, adding, understandably. Brian?
Andrea Mitchell in our Washington bureau with that aspect of this story. Andrea, thanks. When we come back, we'll have the story of how those who lost a lot of brothers on 9/11 are greeting this news from overseas.
When events shake our nation.
Would you rule out a government shutdown if you can't see eye to eye?
And transform our world.
Is this simply too much for the United States to take on?
More people turn to the #1 Sunday public affairs show.
If it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press.
Back here at Ground Zero in New York, while 9/11 changed life in America for all of us, it staggered the New York City Fire Department. 343 firefighters ran into the World Trade Center and never made it back out. Today, we revisited a firehouse in Manhattan that lost 6 men that day, Engine 23, just to see how they were reacting to the news that the mastermind overseas was gone.
First thing I thought of were the families of the 6 guys that worked here, hoping that it would bring them closure to some degree. Great day for the country.
And those 6 are with you every second. They're on the wall, they're on the kitchen table, they're on the rig, figuratively and literally. That's a big part of their presence is really felt here.
Yes. Yes, it was when I got to the firehouse, it was one of the first things that was instilled in me. Never forget those guys. They live on forever.
And it's just a sad day that should always be remembered and never forgotten.
Do you feel a generational pre-9/11, post-9/11 difference?
Well, I came on after 9/11, and we did lose a lot of experience, but we're pretty resilient.
I think it shows a lot of resolve by the U.S. and by the fire department, by bouncing back, and the commitment we have to the country to getting these guys.
A lot of people down in Ground Zero last night were using the word justice, and seemed kind of appropriate. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, justice was served last night, you know.
When you heard the news, what was your reaction? What does it continue to be today?
Everybody was texting. It was all over the news. It was good to hear. It's about time after 10 years. They got him, so it's a relief for all of us. There's a new era. We're ready to go, and that's what we're here for.
And then right at the end of our conversation, duty called. Go. It was time for the men of Engine 23 to answer the alarm again. Our thanks to the men of 23 Engine in Manhattan, the place they call the Lion's Den, some of the best guys you could ever know. We're back with more news right after this.
What's the mission now? Is this still enforcing a no-fly zone, or has it expanded?
About that radiation, what are the chances that that is going to spike, that is going to continue to rise?
Today, America's #1 morning news program.
Our chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, has been stationed overseas covering our nation's dual wars since virtually right after 9/11 happened here. Richard, it makes sense to ask you about reaction throughout the Arab world.
The reaction has been very strong, Brian. There is a hope that this marks the end of America's war on terrorism, which has been so costly, as everyone knows, for the United States, but also incredibly costly for the Middle East. Over the years, the al-Qaeda organization has killed more Muslims than anyone else, and people here blame al-Qaeda whenever they're profiled at airports. People in the region simply want to move on, Brian.
All right, Richard Engel, who is in what has been called the third front, and that's Libya these days, the news that was at the top of the broadcast until this. Now, a word to our viewers, depending on your NBC station, this is an hour-long special edition of Nightly News. If it doesn't air where you live, find us on the web. For us and for now, I'm Brian Williams. I was a viewer before I had this job. I know what I used to expect out of an evening newscast. And they come back to us because of our people, because of our family. They know this is where you're going to learn what happened today. And good evening once again. We are back from Ground Zero in Lower Manhattan, which, as you can hear these days, is plainly a construction site. While it's been almost a decade since the attacks, there is still not a permanent memorial for people to visit, while commerce is getting back up and ready in the form of several high-rise buildings. And, of course, this broadcast, a continuation of our first half hour, part of an hour-long special edition tonight on news of the death of Osama Bin Laden. We want to go to our chief White House correspondent, Chuck Todd, who can report on some of the background that went into this operation and how, for this president, say nothing of his predecessor, Chuck, this has been a long time coming.
It sure has, Brian. You know, it was in August of 2007. Candidate Obama talked about the idea that if he ever got actionable intelligence on where to find bin Laden, he would not hesitate to unilaterally go into Pakistan. It caused him some problems on the campaign trail. But then as president, he found himself having to do just that, get his CIA chief to come up with plans to do just that. And as they say, the rest is the first draft of history.
I think we can all agree this is a good day for America.
A day after the president announced that a U.S. team had killed the most wanted man in the world, more details emerged. It all started with a tip last August.
After years of painstaking work by our intelligence community, I was briefed on a possible lead to bin Laden.
That lead? A courier for Osama bin Laden owned a fortress-like compound that intelligence officials believed had to be protecting someone significant. The National Security Team considered several plans, ranging from airstrikes to a high-risk Special Forces assault.
There were differences of views that were discussed. That's what the president wanted to know, as well as the different what's called COAs, courses of action.
Friday morning, before leaving for Alabama to tour the tornado devastation, the president gave the final order to send in that small team of special operatives. Sunday afternoon, the president and top advisors monitored the operation with live video and audio. The mission only lasted 40 minutes, but to the president and his national security team, it was nerve-wracking, especially since no one was sure that bin Laden was actually there.
It was probably one of the most anxiety-filled periods of time, I think, in the lives of the people who were assembled here yesterday. The minutes passed like days.
The mission had been rehearsed repeatedly, and there was even a full-scale replica of the compound built for practice runs.
Needless to say, when they hit that compound, they had already trained against it numerous times.
2 Black Hawk helicopters ferried in the team. Both were supposed to hover, not land, but one had a mechanical failure and was grounded, causing a moment of panic. As the team swarmed the compound, a firefight ensued. Bin Laden was shot and killed, as was another young woman and 3 others, including the courier. As the Black Hawk helicopters departed, Pakistani military authorities, unaware of the mission, scrambled fighter jets. But the U.S. team made it safely back across the border. Not until then did American officials notify the Pakistanis. Bin Laden's body was identified from facial recognition and DNA testing. And less than 12 hours later, bin Laden's body was brought to a U.S. aircraft carrier and buried at sea. Reaction came from all corners. Former Vice President Dick Cheney.
President Obama and his national security team acted on the intelligence when it came in, and they deserve a lot of credit, too.
There is video footage of bin Laden's burial at sea. A few people here at the White House have seen it. The president has not. By the way, Brian, I can also report the president has talked personally to a couple of those Navy SEALs that participated in the killing and capture of bin Laden.
All right, and Chuck Todd, as you reported last night, after that tense night in the White House, later they were able to hear from inside the White House the kind of spontaneous uproar across the street as people flowed into the streets of Washington, D.C., and the park across the street from the White House to celebrate the news. All of this brings us back to Richard Engel, who is in Libya. And, Richard, you and I have on occasion been given a good glimpse inside U.S. military special operations, but no one can match your time embedded with the U.S. military or speak with the authority you have on this 10-year effort to find this one man.
It is an incredible, when you look back at it, 10 years, America's war on terrorism, and how costly it has been. $1 trillion, thousands of American families, American soldiers who have lost their loved ones in this fight. And it has just been a war that has set the tone for American society for the last decade.
After 9/11, the United States mobilized for war, seeking justice and revenge. Troops invaded Afghanistan almost immediately. Within 2 months, al-Qaeda's hosts, the Taliban, were thrown out of power. Osama bin Laden got away. But regime change in Afghanistan, done with few troops and high technology, seemed so easy. The Bush White House tried it again in Iraq. U.S. officials said Saddam Hussein was developing weapons of mass destruction and linked Iraq to 9/11 and bin Laden.
Oh, the reason I keep insisting that there was a relationship between Iraq and Saddam and al-Qaeda, because there was a relationship between Iraq and al-Qaeda.
Afghanistan and Iraq were lumped together in what was called a global war on terrorism. The truth was, there was never a connection between Iraq and Osama bin Laden. There were no weapons of mass destruction either. But when civil war in Iraq broke out, American troops were stuck. Deployment after deployment, trying to stop the daily carnage. The cost was enormous. More than 4,400 American troops dead, along with 150,000 Iraqis. And it was a distraction from the United States' original mission to find bin Laden, stop al-Qaeda, and prevent another 9/11. With American troops tied down in Baghdad, al-Qaeda and the Taliban slipped back into Afghanistan, a fight the United States is still waging. But now, a major victory the United States has had to wait 10 years to see. Osama bin Laden is dead, killed not by a massive troop deployment, but by a commando raid carried out by a few dozen highly trained men and helicopters.
With Osama bin Laden's death, this chapter of America's war on terrorism, a war that has defined the military, defined American culture even, may be ending. Brian?
Richard Engel, always on the road covering conflict for us tonight in Libya. Richard, thanks. And at the top of the broadcast, we talked about what bin Laden did here and how it has affected life in America in ways we sometimes forget. We asked our justice correspondent, Pete Williams, to look at all of it for us tonight. Pete's in Washington. Pete, good evening.
Brian, it was because of the 9/11 attacks that the government created this sprawling new entity, the Department of Homeland Security. But as significant as bin Laden's death is, the experts say it won't make an immediate change in the terror threat.
Taking no chances, New York's police commissioner ordered a show of force, beefing up security at subway stations, trains, and other sensitive sites.
Our assumption is that bin Laden's disciples would like nothing better than to avenge his death by another attack in New York. That is our operating premise.
Here in Washington, police stepped up patrols downtown and on mass transit. At airports, extra dog teams and behavioral recognition officers were out. An FBI official said agents were increasing surveillance on the small number of suspected plots they've been watching for weeks unrelated to bin Laden's death. But Janet Napolitano, the Homeland Security Secretary, said that with no intelligence of an actual threat of retaliation, there was no reason to issue a threat alert to the public or local governments. The 9/11 attacks and subsequent plots bin Laden inspired transformed the U.S. security landscape. For air travelers, a ban on sharp objects, closer inspection of shoes, then a clampdown on liquids.
Creams, toothpaste, hair gel.
New and revealing body scanners, plus intrusive and controversial pat-downs. And thousands of federal air marshals on high-risk flights. And for now, none of that will change. Intelligence experts say the danger now comes from al-Qaeda-inspired groups around the world. In Yemen, where the recent cargo bomb and underwear bomb plots were hatched, and from homegrown terrorists who have no connection to al-Qaeda or bin Laden and remain a threat.
If anything, it might go up in the short term because people who are not directly connected to the al-Qaeda group, kids in places like Texas or California or London or France, are going to say, look, I'm angry at what happened and I want to go out and do something.
The only actual government warning comes from the State Department, urging Americans overseas to watch out for any potential anti-U.S. violence, Brian.
Pete Williams in Washington. At one of the first places we had to get to know after 9/11, as Pete pointed out, the Department of Homeland Security. One of the many new organizations in the post-9/11 era is Voices of 9/11. It was founded by Mary Fetchett for the worst possible reason. You lost your son, Brad. He was 24 years old. He worked here in the World Trade Center, and full disclosure, I knew him too. And I don't know sometimes how you gather the strength to come back here and be here and bear witness to all this, but how did you greet the news from overseas?
Well, I think initially I was shocked when I heard the news last night, and then it's just been a roller coaster of emotions. I think we felt comfort, appreciation, certainly to the administration and the brave military installation that went in, and the operation. But I just think that it's, there's no closure. When you lose a son in a terrorist attack, like the other 3,000 families, you learn to live with it.
And bin Laden took Brad from you. How personal was it for you, directed at him?
I wanted accountability. Certainly I wanted to have him held accountable. But I feel that if you have revenge, they win in the end, that you really have to have hope. And, our organization provides support to the families, and we're working with them to commemorate their loved ones. And I think moving forward and helping people through that grieving process and commemoration is certainly more productive.
Mary Fetchett, again, the founder of Voices of 9/11. Everyone watching joins me in saying we're sorry for your loss. Thank you for coming back here today. When we come back, the extraordinary American Special Forces who pulled off this attack, their story when we continue.
Who's making tomorrow's history today? The extraordinary men and women of the Griots 100, living their dreams and changing our world. Their stories this month on the platforms of NBC News and thegrio.com.
If you were watching our special coverage last night, you heard me ask our viewers send in video of the celebrations that popped up across the country last night. So many of them on college campuses because this so marked the college generation that's in school right now. You sent them in. There are just 4 of them. There are many, many more. This operation, we keep saying, was carried out by U.S. Special Forces, but most of the commandos on this raid were from the branch of the service that will tell you they are the very best and the toughest to get into, with an 80% failure rate, and that's the U.S. Navy SEALs. Their headquarters, Coronado, California. Our own George Lewis spent time with them there today.
Most people who start the punishing 3 years of SEAL training discover they're not cut out for this. 3 out of 4 will drop out before they complete the course.
What's going on with this boat crew? Get your head on the correct side.
The Navy goes to extremes here, emphasizing extreme physical fitness, extreme mental alertness, and extreme courage.
It's a lot of physical training, a lot of mental strain upon them.
In this exercise, SEALs are taught to react quickly in a dark environment. As the hoods are pulled off their heads, they have to target the bad guys. The kinds of skills that would have been needed on the Bin Laden mission. Today, few people in Coronado were surprised that the SEALs carried it out.
I think all of us kind of had a clue that if and when they ever took him down, it would probably be the SEALs.
This is a big SEAL team community, so we're really proud.
One drink to the SEALs.
One drink to the SEALs. This was the scene last night at a bar owned by a former SEAL.
You can always count on the Navy SEAls to do, and the Special Forces to do all the hard jobs.
Rear Admiral Ed Winters, in charge of the SEALs, sent out this email. Today, we should all be proud. That handful of courageous men of strong will and character have changed the course of history. The fight is not over. Even as more young SEAL recruits train to join that fight. Their admiral calls the SEALs the quiet professionals. Because they operate in secrecy, the men who took part in the Bin Laden operation may never be recognized publicly. Brian?
George Lewis, Coronado, California. George, thanks. I'm glad we covered that aspect of this story. When we come back, the story that was at the top of the news for several days, the suffering ongoing in the American South.
When events shake our nation.
Would you rule out a government shutdown if you can't see eye to eye?
And transform our world.
Is this simply too much for the United States to take on?
More people turn to the #1 Sunday public affairs show.
If it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press.
We're back from Ground Zero in New York, and let's go back now to the place where we were when we last saw you Friday night. Tuscaloosa, Alabama, part of a 6-state region that got hit by that awful tornado outbreak. Death toll in the hundreds, and now, sadly, some big rains on the way. NBC's John Yang is covering there for us tonight. John?
Good evening, Brian. The death toll in those 6 states now 343. 249 of the dead here in Alabama. But what's worrying officials is that hundreds are missing still. 340 missing here in Tuscaloosa County. But still, the residents tonight here feel that they have turned a corner. Across Tuscaloosa today, the sounds of recovery. Officials acknowledge progress won't be fast.
We're all coming to the realization that this process is going to be difficult. It's going to be painful, and it's going to take a lot of time for us to make it through.
It's a real race against time and against Mother Nature to get tarps on these damaged houses. There's heavy rain in the forecast. University of Alabama students are helping, finding those who need them by Twitter or just driving around. Because the tornado cut the school year short, they could go home, but they're staying to lend a hand.
We live here and we use Tuscaloosa 9 months out of the year like it's our home, and
when something like this affects all these people around here, you know, you can't sit in and not help.
I don't want it to fall on somebody.
For Robert Mills, they're a godsend.
These gentlemen out here that came in and volunteered, their services, super.
With so many still without power,
Anybody has anything to drop off?
car radios are the way to ask for and offer help.
You're live on the air. How can we help?
Country DJ Wild Bill Setbach spends as many as 14 hours a day on the air, taking calls, talking himself hoarse.
You're wondering if you messed up by stopping.
And worrying that he isn't doing enough.
My job is to connect A to B. There's the person who needs something, and then there's the person who has something.
It's not just local people who are reaching out a helping hand. The city's call center, the volunteer hotline, has gotten calls from as far away as California and New Hampshire. Brian, they have one simple question. What can we do to help?
John, thanks for that. John Yang in Tuscaloosa, home, as we learned of some terrific people. We'll take a break. When we come back, some memories here tonight of a September day we would all like to forget.
What's the mission now? Is this still enforcing a no-fly zone, or has it expanded?
About that radiation, what are the chances that that is going to spike, that is going to continue to rise?
Today, America's #1 morning news program.
We're back here tonight from Ground Zero in Lower Manhattan. Every so often we're forced to remember in detail what happened on 9/11. Tonight it's probably useful to remember what Osama Bin Laden did to us here. NBC's Rahema Ellis down at ground level with more on that. Rahema, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. On 9/11, lives changed dramatically. Today, the news about Osama Bin Laden stirred up painful memories that for many people never go away. The initial reports on that crisp fall morning were at first unclear.
We have a breaking news story to tell you about. Apparently, a plane has just crashed into the World Trade Center here in New York City.
No one could have imagined what would unfold.
It's quite terrifying. I'm in shock right now.
After the first crash into the North Tower at 8:46 a.m., word of a second plane into the South Tower at 9:03 a.m., and the horrifying picture started to emerge.
You have to move from talk about a possible accident to talk about something deliberate that has happened here.
Then, unbelievably, a third plane. This one crashed into the Pentagon at 9:37 a.m.
People here in the building are already describing as a highly sophisticated, coordinated attack.
America was under attack.
It goes without saying this is the most serious attack in the United States in more than 100 years.
In Lower Manhattan, chaos and terror.
It was crazy. It was the craziest thing I've ever done in my life.
We would soon learn that a plane that crashed near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, was intended for the Capitol, but was overtaken by courageous passengers and forced down.
Everyone in the city should remain calm. The very best thing to do right now would be to remain home.
President Bush spoke to the nation.
Terrorism against our nation will not stand.
New Yorkers and all Americans were suddenly vulnerable. Were you afraid for your life?
Completely terrified. We're all crying, hysterical.
From the passengers on United Flight 93 to the first responders, the definition of brave changed forever on September 11th, 2001. Today at Ground Zero, there is still pain.
No one should have to die like that.
But also a sense of a new beginning with Bin Laden dead.
There was a dark cloud looming over this place as long as he was still alive. Now that he's gone, the sun has come out and the cloud is gone.
And time seemed to stand still on September 11th, but now each new day seems to bring just a little more healing. Brian?
And from here in Ground Zero in Lower Manhattan, that is with thanks to Rahema Ellis and all of our team, our special hour-long broadcast tonight. I'm Brian Williams. We'll look for you here tomorrow evening.